Hello, and welcome to the 30th episode of the Interview Series, a production of the Iowa-based arts and education nonprofit 1 Week Critique, which provides pedagogical resources and editorial support to students and teachers of the literary arts. You can learn more about our programs or support our work by visiting oneweekcritique.com. That's the number 1weekcritique.com. Today, I'm joined by Joseph Holt, whose debut story collection, Golden Heart Parade, just came out this September from Santa Fe Writers Project. Welcome, Joe, and congratulations on the first book.
Hey, thanks, Matthew.
Of course. Maybe we can just start off by having you talk about your overall writing journey leading up to the publication of your book. How long did it take you to write? What was your trajectory? And what were some of the hurdles that you had to surpass along the way?
Right. Well, Golden Heart Parade is my debut collection. And in a lot of ways, it's like the accumulation of many of the stories I wrote as I was learning to write. So the book is published in fall 2021. And I think I began drafting some of these stories 13 or 14 years ago, roughly. And they went through a lot of drafts, of course. I began writing seriously around 2005 when I entered the University of North Dakota for my MA degree in English. So that's when I took my first workshop. And I fumbled around a little bit. And once I left the program at the University of North Dakota, I continued drafting stories. Probably half the stories or so of Golden Heart Parade come from that time between my master's degree at the University of North Dakota and when I began my PhD at the University of Southern Mississippi 6 years later. So my writing trajectory is that it took me a long time to learn how to write stories, and I became a debut author at age 40. As I noted, a lot of the stories are fairly old, like the one we'll be discussing today, Road Songs. I'm pretty sure I wrote down the first lines in my notebook for that, maybe around 2008 or 2009. And then it was published in a literary journal in 2012 or 2013. And then, another 8 years passed or so until it appeared in the book. So it wasn't a lot of short, concentrated effort to get to the book Golden Heart Parade. Rather, it was just a lot of slow accumulation of work.
Yeah, so did you think, when I asked about hurdles a little bit, like what kinds of things do you think, maybe made it difficult to get there, right? It's a kind of a long process, to start in 2005 or so, and then write for several years before publishing this particular story anyway. You went to several different programs. I'm kind of interested here in thinking about the long game. For a lot of authors, right, you have to play the long game.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of a constant dread or something that hangs over you where you're like, I don't know if I'm really a writer or what kind of writer, or I'm not like a popular writer, or, people aren't, picking up my stories left and right,
Yeah. The hurdles I faced were myself getting better in regard to technique, expanding my range of the types of stories that I would write. And I guess like getting recognition for my work. But as a young writer, I thought my work deserved more recognition than it did. I'd be like, wow, why am I not getting a break? Why isn't the New Yorker accepting a story of mine or something? I wasn't really submitting to the New Yorker, but do you think like, why are these good journals rejecting me, when I just didn't really understand how the industry works, that there are so many other capable and competent writers out there, and I was still trying to become capable and competent myself. It's just a very slow learning process, not only about writing, but also developing realistic expectations for my work. Further, there's a hurdle of short stories aren't particularly commercially viable. I never sought an agent for short stories. And instead, like once I had my manuscript, I would submit it to contests. So you're kind of paying out money and crossing your fingers for contests that might have 300 entrants or more. Yeah, so it's kind of hard to break through in a field where there's maybe not a lot of commercial interest.
Right, definitely. So as you said, today we're going to be looking at Road Songs, which actually ends Golden Heart Parade. And initially it was titled My Rig is the Wild, Wild Heart, which is a lyric by Bill Staines. Initially, this story was published in Foxing Quarterly, and it's quite different from the one published in Golden Heart Parade. I'm going to ask you to summarize the story a little bit, and then I'm going to bring up the excerpt that we'll be looking at on the screen here for our readers.
Okay. Yeah, the original title, My Rig is the Wild, Wild Heart, comes from a folk song by Bill Staines, a singer who's been around for decades, a New England touring artist. Foxing Quarterly was a journal that existed for only a few issues. It was a really beautiful journal with great visual art, but it was, I think, probably a labor-intensive production without much funding, so it folded fairly quickly. The story, if I was to summarize it in one sentence, a naive teenager from small city South Dakota joins his absent father on a cross-country road trip, only to be abandoned in far-off Colorado. With the exception of some exposition at the end and like a flash forward code at the end, some exposition at the beginning and then some summary at the end, 2 or 3 days pass in the time of the story. So it's a fairly compressed story. It's just the road trip itself. And we're looking now at the original version, an excerpt that comes about halfway through in the original published version from Foxing Quarterly. Did you want me to read any of this?
If you could you can just start in on the story. I guess basically, right, it's a father-son road trip in the father's 18-wheeler. He's a truck driver. And I think that's pretty good for where we want to pick up, right?
Yeah. And so this original version I find to be a little bit tedious. And I was going to read I just couldn't even really bring myself to read the originally published version because I'm so familiar with the revised version that appears in the book now. Here in this original version, this is just halfway through the story when the father and son first leave the mother driving west out of Aberdeen, South Dakota. After an hour on the road, I asked, "Do you think you and Mom will ever be a couple again?" Ahead of us, the sun had fallen behind the western plains, casting the low horizon in layers of orange and pink. We traveled along Highway 12, a straight 2-lane bordered by snow-patched farmland and occasional lamp-lit farmhouses. It had been miles since we had passed another set of headlights. He cocked his head toward me as if to answer, but then stared back at the road. Eventually, the crackling AM radio, quietly tuned to a livestock market report, blurred away the echo of my question. "Is Aberdeen your hometown?" I asked. "I graduated with your mom." That's the father speaking. "You ever see your family, like your parents, when you're back in town?" "They're gone now," he told me. I didn't know what this meant, if they had passed away or moved on. He didn't clarify, though in hindsight I wish I'd asked, even if it changed nothing. They're my ancestors too. "What are you carrying in the back?" "What are you carrying?" I asked, "in the back?" "Furniture." "Who's it for?" "Just a company." "You said earlier you live in Big Sky. How often are you there?" "Why do you ask?" "You got a nice place?" "It's small and uncomfortable and deteriorating by the day. I have the mind to get out and start someplace new, maybe the coast, the Southwest. Who knows?" He stared ahead into the dusk. Soon the Missouri River appeared ahead of us. We turned south toward Pierre. Beside me was the wide river, black just then in the early nightfall. Out along the banks flashed the shapes of overgrown trees and clotted wild grass. "Well, look at this," he said. I squinted up ahead at the road, but saw nothing. Then just a sparkle. He flashed the high beams, and a line of pronghorn deer, a half dozen of them perhaps, appeared on the near bank of the ditch. They were lined up as if to make a run across the highway, and the lead deer had gone as far as the shoulder. It stared blankly into the truck's headlights, unmoving. I turned as if to warn Chuck, but without decelerating, he began drifting into the oncoming lane. He pulled the air horn and flashed between his low and high beams. I clutched the vinyl handle above the door, bracing myself for the worst. Then, in an instant, the lead deer turned away and bounded through the tall ditchweed of the embankment. The others followed, scattering, their white tails bobbing once or twice before they disappeared into the scrub. I looked back through the side view mirror, but saw only the running lights of the trailer behind us. Then my father whispered something. He spoke so quietly, I initially thought the radio had crackled in. "Love," he said, "it's just a decision, not an instinct like everyone would have you believe." He stared straight ahead as if he were alone in the truck. "Affection's what you can't control. That's the deep one, the one poets do wrong to ignore." He dimmed the beams. We rode on in silence. The night turned dark, starless and moonless.
All right, thank you. So, as we said, the initial title is from a Bill Staines lyric. Why did you choose to include the Bill Staines lyric, which does remain in the final draft, although it's not the title anymore?
Yeah.
And how do you see it adding to the story? Furthermore, could you explain the process you had to go through in order to obtain the rights to use that lyric?
Yeah. Bill Staines isn't very widely known, but my mom likes Bill Staines a lot. The story is about a mother-son relationship as much as it is a father-son relationship. I think probably in the time I was composing this, I attended a Bill Staines house concert in St. Paul with my mom. And I just really liked the song Wild, Wild Heart. I think because I was writing this trucking story, this song about living a life as an 18-wheel driver stuck in my memory, and it just became that title, My Rig is the Wild, Wild Heart. When I was taking the manuscript and revising it into what would become the book, I guess I kind of broke with that as the title, as sounding maybe a little pretentious. It's funny, it's not pretentious when Bill Staines sings it, but when I isolate My Rig is the Wild, Wild Heart and put his title, I was less in love with it. When I revised the story then, I kind of wanted to honor that original influence. So now in an earlier scene before what we just looked at, the father in the story jams at the piano, and I quote verbatim the lyric where he says, "My rig is the wild, wild heart," along with some other stuff in the story itself. To get the rights, I had to email Bill Staines and say, "You don't know me, but my book is coming out," and I sort of explained the situation. I just, Poets and Writers at the time, Poets and Writers magazine had published a story about securing the rights for, I don't know, like lines of poetry and books and so on. And it's really not that difficult. It's not like a rigorous legal process. Getting confirmation by email is enough. Some people might say, like, sure, you can use my line of poetry if you pay me $200 or something, but I don't think anyone ever pays residuals for the rights. It's a one-time fee. And Bill Staines didn't request any payment or anything. He just gave a short reply saying that would be wonderful.
Excellent. In the early draft, there's a lot of dialogue and not as much exposition. The final version, which we'll look at here a little bit later, gives a lot of backstory to Rick, who was Chuck in this early version. There's a couple of things I'd like to touch on here. What's in a name, right? Like, we move from Chuck to Rick. We've got the same CK ending, basically.
Yeah.
Did changing the name from Chuck to Rick help you understand or rewrite the story in a particular way? And also adding Rick's backstory makes him a much more well-rounded character in the final version of this. How did you figure out who Rick was and what his history was?
Yeah, at first you said, the initial story when it was called My Rig is the Wild, Wild Heart was a lot of dialogue and very little exposition. And I think that's the only way I knew how to write 10 years ago. It was almost as if I was writing a screenplay in prose form. I was afraid of writing exposition and maybe a little reluctant to do the hard creative work of fleshing out characters' backstories. I was afraid that exposition distracted from the immediate narrative. And that's wrong. But that was kind of the attitude I had and why I think I relied so much on dialogue and very little explanation. I changed Chuck to Rick because there's a character named Chip 2 stories before Road Songs. So to go from Chip to Chuck are 2 kind of similar, unserious names. And it's not a big change to go from Chuck to Rick, but I do believe Rick is a little more serious than Chuck. I don't know. Maybe the Chucks of the world might protest. So really the change from Chuck to Rick was just based on trying to avoid the Chip Chuck repetition within the book. Then you also asked about fleshing out his backstory. I just found him upon review to be a pretty one-dimensional, flat character. He was meant to be mysterious, I guess, an absent father who you haven't thought about ever appears. But then he didn't really reveal anything about himself, and with no revelation, there wasn't much of a greater understanding on the part of the narrator by the end. I thought it would be more fun, perhaps, if Rick became kind of like a bit of a grifter or a drifter or a liar, one who maybe exaggerates his own story, not as pathologically, but just to maybe make himself look better. So I had to reveal, as we'll see probably in the excerpt I'll read from Road Songs here, what his background was. You might not think all of this is true, but it's the story he tells about himself that helps us understand why he's more comfortable living a life on the road as opposed to even keeping in touch with his son and his son's mother.
Yeah, so you summarize a good portion of the dialogue, as we kind of talked about here, between Rick and Scotty, who's his son, from Scotty's perspective in the later version. Why does moving the action from dialogue in scene to reported information Scotty receives from Rick, thus basically breaking up the direct communication between characters and moving that communication specifically toward readers? Why does that work better here? You mentioned like you didn't think you could do that, and that you over time found out that in fact that's a good thing to do. Maybe you could discuss your reordering process in general.
Sure, I have a good analogy for that. When I was an undergraduate taking video production class, we would have to do our video editing on like an actual editing bay as opposed to computer software. And we had a dial, to speed up the film. It was called, we would jog it forward and then slow it down. And it was basically a way of fast forwarding stuff. I've since learned how to like jog forward the narration within a story by summarizing stuff. To think, there's a 2-hour conversation we might have in our lives where if we were to transcribe every word of that conversation, it would be incredibly dull. But if we can just summarize it into a single paragraph, it's much more interesting. And then we can be selective about including the relevant points. I kind of learned through the process of editing this story and also through my work in the graduate program at the University of Southern Mississippi, how to manipulate time. And as I noted, the first version of the story, when I reviewed it, seemed rather tedious. It's because I was giving boring dialogue. So I zipped forward some of these scenes just because I wanted to get through them faster, and I didn't want it to be a 15,000 word story where it feels like you're just reading a basic transcription of people's conversation. Let's see, as far as reordering the story, the structure remains the same, but I feel like the balance is a little bit different in some scenes. And some scenes cover more time because I'm able to say, you know, as I noted in a paragraph, what's discussed over a longer period of time.
Yeah, I really like that idea of manipulating time. I think that's a really hard thing to do, like early on when you're beginning to write. That you don't have to just report the information, right? You can kind of move into like how that information is making a character feel, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. I know I would try to I would try to feel out every corner of a scene. And I think that's because I was under the thumb of the dirty realists, and particularly Raymond Carver. When I was in graduate school at the University of North Dakota, and Raymond Carver moves a lot of his stories very slowly, but if I recall, he's not afraid to provide some exposition every now and again too. And I was just probably mimicking Hemingway and Raymond Carver, not really aware that Alice Munro was out there. And there were a lot of other examples of writers who produce novelistic short stories that move very fluidly and very confidently.
Definitely. You know, you're from South Dakota originally, and you seem to have an obsession with characters in small towns, or I guess largely outside of the big city. Um, you know, often they're at some sort of margin on the society. You know, what drives you to tell stories about characters that aren't in big cities? Is that, you know, stemming from where you grew up, or do you just, I don't know, connect with those characters in a different way than you would someone in a bustling metropolis?
Yeah, I guess I maybe write what I know in regard to geography, and the geography determines the personality of these characters. So around South Dakota, there's a lot of room to roam. I know the landscape well. If I was to try, like say I lived in Minneapolis for a while, and there's just such depth to Minneapolis that I could never even know all the complexity of like my particular district. But in my hometown of Aberdeen, I feel like I know those streets so well. And I know the people who populate that area. I just feel a little more comfortable in these wide open spaces of the Midwest. And you mentioned also marginal characters. I think marginal characters might want more. They might strive more. They might be a little less comfortable in their given circumstances, making them more opportune for creating drama because they'll pursue something.
Yeah. So now you're teaching at University of Alaska Fairbanks. Are we going to see some Alaska stories in the near future?
But, you know, maybe, but I never really feel confident describing a place I've lived until after I've left it. So it still feels like there's so much mystery around Fairbanks that I'm very afraid of getting geographical details wrong, of like getting called out for making stuff up by like researching via Google Maps, you know. But the people around Alaska are very interesting, and they're not that different from the people in South Dakota. They're just isolated even more so geographically. They're very hardy people. I think I might try writing some Alaskan stories. The landscape would certainly figure into any Alaskan stories because it is so unique.
Yeah, the other thing that you spend a lot of time doing is you're a big long distance runner, and so I imagine you've, you know, spent a lot of time outdoors in Alaska, and that somehow just being in the landscape would help you kind of understand at least the contours of the place as far as land wise goes.
Yeah, it forces me to get my bearings around a place, to notice the trees, the level of the ground, kind of the nooks, the back roads. You know, it's funny you mentioned that because I only started running when we were down in Hattiesburg, Mississippi together. I began running in the time since I first drafted Road Songs as My Rig is the Wild Wild Heart. And then when I revised it, in the original version, the main character, it's like a throwaway detail. He's a sprinter on his high school track team, but then it becomes a defining personality characteristic in the final draft because I knew more to write confidently about distance running and the way it frees one's spirit.
I think maybe the most important editing that you did from this first draft to the last draft is moving the narration of the story from an objective narration from Scotty to more of an explanatory and interpretive narration from Scotty, where he takes more part in it. How did you arrive at this particular revision process? And what sorts of things were you looking to change from the earlier draft?
I wanted to disrupt that tedium of only observing the surface level stuff in the original draft. And a first person narrator, I guess, should be allowed to interpret. You can still have an objective first person narrator who doesn't bother interpreting or commenting on anything. That's pretty close to what we kind of think of as what we talk about when we talk about love era Raymond Carver. Once again, early on, I just don't know if I felt comfortable breaking away from the surface narrative of the story, which is why there's a little interpretation. But that also implies that I wasn't probing psychologically the narrator, Scotty, and how he felt about stuff. In both the original version and the final version of the story, there's perspective built into the story. We get the impression that Scotty is narrating these events many years after they've happened. Well, that naturally opens the door for him to interpret stuff, explain his feelings, and kind of look back in hindsight across time about why this stuff was meaningful, why we're telling the story. Even in the final version, I don't think there's a lot of breaking away from the narrative, but there is, you're right, there is more interpretation. Of all the stories in Golden Heart Parade, when the manuscript was accepted to when it was published, every story got shorter by probably 10 or 15%. And it wasn't even structural changes, just sentence level changes, cutting out unnecessary words or repetitious narration. Road Songs is the only story that actually expanded, and it got richer with detail.
Definitely, yeah. Let's look at that detail in this other version, the final version that was published. Here we are.
So this is the same scene. It's a bit longer because I've added in, there's just more discussion. It was like a very claustrophobic scene where the father, then Chuck, was avoiding the narrator's questions in the last version we looked at. In this one, prior to this particular scene, some information has already been established. One, very briefly at the beginning, that Rick was a semi-pro baseball player, a touring musician, and a rodeo man. And I think we already know by this point that there's Amish furniture in the back of the trailer. So I could go ahead and read this?
Yes, please.
All right. Rick and I headed west on a 2-lane highway while the sky was still cloudless and blue. We passed by farmhouses and muddy fields, small ponds on which the ice was receding. Rick steered with a spinner knob on the wheel, which lay almost parallel to his lap. The CB radio crackled on with coded, taciturn messages, background noise like a bird call in sunlight. I asked what was so special about Amish furniture. The craftsmanship, Rick said. It's built to last. Was it always furniture in the back? No, he said. He was a contract driver. He'd driven grain trucks and hauled cattle, timber, lumber, granite slabs. He was not a corporate driver, though he'd moved new cars and heavy machinery, turbine blades and 50-foot augers. This is only temporary, he said. Driving truck is not my forever career. And I would stop right here and point out, like in these paragraphs, I am still using dialogue tags. I asked the craftsmanship, Rick said, there's another he said, and then the next paragraph there's he asked, he said. So this is like evident of the summarized dialogue where we don't have the quotation marks. It's not directly reported, and we just get it basically compressed rather than him directly reporting that speech. He asked if I played baseball. He said he'd played shortstop for a single A team in Wisconsin Rapids, and in only half a season he'd set the league record for inside the park home runs. That's not an official record, he clarified. They weren't tracking it back then. He said if the ball even touched the outfield grass, he could stretch it into a double. Then the week before he was set for promotion, a guy named Rincon slid hard into second trying to bust up a double play, snapping Rick's ankle. And that ended that, he said. I was a contact hitter. Speed was my game. But not for a minute did he believe this Rincon character was playing fair. These boys will mow you down just to level the field. Remember that. After that, he toured with Paulie Knox and the Best Boys, a rockabilly band as he described it. Rick handled keyboards and steel guitar, even sang backing vocals. He and the boys played beer joints, street dances, county fairs. We'd set up in an empty lot and have 100 people dancing by dusk. They'd even met Bon Jovi in the early days, and everyone said it was a coin flip which band would break out first. I never heard of Paulie Knox, I said. You can forget Paulie Knox. The man was a rodent. What did he do? Tell you what he didn't do, Rick said. He didn't write the music or the lyrics. The band's claim to fame, passing fame, was a series of regional anthems all meant for specific radio markets. Smokin' in Spokane, Little Miss Missoula, The Boys from Boise. He sang me a chorus, which was catchy but unfamiliar. The songs weren't meant to be silver records, he said, but some of them sold almost 5,000 copies. Fort Collins, Provo, Reno, Coeur d'Alene. I could draw you a highway map of the royalties I rightly deserve. Then there was a rodeo league. Rick himself was not a cowboy, but he was a founding board member and managed all the franchising, venues, sponsorships, licensing. I took every photo on those trading cards, he said. The league competed on Fridays in the fall, with rosters from Alberta to Oklahoma. Well, not Oklahoma, but we were getting there. It was in the plans. By year 3, they'd nearly cleared their debt, but then an old cattleman named Butch Wagner forced Rick out in a power grab and the league soon folded. Their loss. I was this close, he said, showing with his thumb and forefinger, this close to selling the TV rights. Now we'll never know. By then, the sun had fallen over the western plains. The night had turned dark, starless and moonless. We'd been through Pier and across the river, through Fort Pier, further south. We rolled over buttes and bluffs, past icy lakes and penned-in cattle. Well, well, Rick said, look at this. He flashed the high beams. Out ahead, a line of white-tailed deer had blockaded the road. There were a half dozen of them at least, standing still as lawn ornaments, their neon eyes glowing in the lights. Slow down, I said. Rick, stop. But he only drifted toward the center line. He pulled the horn and flashed his lights, and in the moment before impact, in the time it would take to snap one's fingers, the deer split like a parting river, their cottony tails bobbing into the ditch. I looked back through the side view mirror, but saw only the running lights of our trailer. Fucking crap, I said. They know better than we do, said Rick. They ain't stupid. Sure looked that way. I've been doing this a while, he said. We turned west onto the interstate. Rick cracked his window and lit a thin cigar. The radio was tuned to a livestock report, with talk of steers and heifers, hogs and poultry. Our headlights shone on billboards and fence posts, long fields of native grass. Do you think you and Mom will ever be a couple again? Who said that? I must have said it. But it was a naive thought that shouldn't have been put to words. Rick cocked his head like he misheard me. Ahead of us, an old sedan on the shoulder was flashing its hazards, and we passed it without slowing down. The AM radio crackled, blurring the space between me and Rick.
Yeah, that final draft there, right? It's so much richer in detail. We've got Rick telling us, or telling Scotty, all of these things that he was really good at, right? And like, each of those stories is hilarious because it ends like right on that precipice where he just about breaks into greatness, but never does. So like, it's fun for the reader. I imagine it was fun for you to write, like thinking about what kind of a person Rick is. And like, this is, I don't know, I think this is the first time Rick has met Scotty, at least
Yeah,
since he's kind of known who he was.
yeah.
Um, and so like, he's detailing like what some of his past was, but like the highlight parts, right?
He's kind of creating his own mythology.
Yeah, embellished to a T, right? Like so many things.
Yeah, some
Like,
of those details when I read, like when I read it, I was like that scene where like they'd even met Bon Jovi back in the early days. That's maybe a little fun to write because it's just like who knows if that would be true or not. It's just sort of a silly detail, silly claim. You can't dispute it.
yeah, but in like the sports, the baseball episode, like, you meet somebody and they'll be like, yeah, I was so good once upon a
Yeah.
time in my glory days, right? Like I could stretch a single into a double every time, right?
Yeah. You almost get the impression that these people tell the same stories over and over again, and they're kind of building themselves up. I think Rick remains kind of bitter at the end of every story about how it didn't work out for one reason or another.
Definitely. I love, actually, I really love the detail, the spinner wheel, the spinner knob on the steering wheel, just because like, my grandpa had an old tractor with one of those spinner knobs,
Yeah.
and it's like one of those things where you're put in the cab of the truck, and like I think it's earlier or later, I can't remember, but like we get like a view of the inside of his cab and like where he sleeps and so forth, right? Like adding all those details allows us, even if we haven't been inside an 18 wheeler, to
Mhm.
kind of know what it's like just from looking at it from the outside and from the details you're giving us.
Yeah, thanks. I think that I probably conducted internet research. I really don't like doing internet research, but to get inside a cab, I've been in like construction trucks and pickup trucks that are dirty like that, but an 18-wheeler cab is different from others. And that spinner knob, I'm sure that I came across that detail and thought this is very telling. That makes a distinction between the the seat of a Toyota Celica and a powerful 18-wheeler.
Yeah, definitely. I think my favorite moment of this revision is when Rick says of the deer, quote, "They know better than we do," end quote. It's like it's the closest thing to advice Rick provides Scotty, like in this whole like several, 2 or 3 days on the road together, as a parental figure. And it's simultaneously the hardest he looks at himself as a person. Um, and yet, like, you think about the deer, and the deer are simply reacting to the lights and the noise, and preserving their own life, right? To split off the road.
Mhm.
How do you arrive at a line like this? Because I think it's such an excellent line. It works on so many levels. You get to, think about all of these different situations for the different parties involved. Um, and maybe like in what ways can a fiction writer humanize their characters?
Well, thanks so much for your kind words there. Um, I like the line of dialogue before that when Scotty says "fucking crap," because it's funny to have the F word, but then crap piled on top of one. I'm not sure, like necessarily how I might have arrived at that line where Rick says they know better than we do. It maybe seems natural in the moment that he downplays the danger that so scared Scotty. And it is maybe you're right that it is probably a recognition that if deer follow their instincts, as you said, and that's helps them survive. You might then extend that metaphor to say, Rick is following his instincts to be on the road rather than to be a doting father. And that's the only thing that's kept him going all these years. I'm not sure, like I've thought of it on such levels in the act of composition. Like I don't remember when it was I wrote that line. It didn't appear in the original version. So it must have been fairly recently. Maybe it's just a kind of a truism that we're able to read into by observing the naturalistic details that were already there in the previous draft. They needed to speak after the deer parted, and that would seem to be the naturalistic dialogue coming from Rick at that point.
Well, yeah, that's like one of the things that how we learn to be in the world as a child, right? Like, you touch something hot, you remember that thing's hot because, you experience that, right? So yeah, it's like learning from repeated actions, like what will probably happen
Yeah.
if you do the same thing again.
Yeah, I think Rick says, like, I've been doing this a long time. So it seems like the danger Scotty sees in the world, Rick has already been through it and known what's worth worry and what's not worth worry.
So as we said, this collection came out with Santa Fe Writers Project. What did you learn about revising this story on a deadline for publication of the book? And how was it working with Andrew Gifford at Santa Fe Writers Project? How did he help you with your understanding of the revision process and the overall rewriting process?
I had just a wonderful experience with Santa Fe Writers Project, and I would be very happy to extol the virtues of independent publishing, where I got to play an active part of the process, bringing the manuscript to a book. Initially, Road Songs, or at the time, My Rig is the Wild, Wild Heart, was the second to last story in the manuscript. The final story in the manuscript was one called In My Life with Carl Lehman. When my assigned editor and I were looking at the stories, I said, I think we're going to have to pull My Rig is the Wild, Wild Heart. It's just not good enough. So I'm going to revise the manuscript and take that story out. And once I get through that process of revising the manuscript, then I'll look at My Rig is the Wild, Wild Heart and try and determine if it's salvageable. This was during the pandemic, and I had a lot of isolated time, which was actually pretty good for the active revision. So I revised My Rig is the Wild, Wild Heart into Road Songs through another couple drafts, even, I'd say. And my assigned editor said, I think the story is much better now, and it will be best to move it to the final story of the collection. So I had the opportunity to rework this story and a lot of the stories. We had nearly 2 years from the point of acceptance to the point of publication. And that gave me a chance to do substantial developmental editing on all of the works. None of them changed so much in structure or form, as I noted, but sentences got crisper. And that was just a result of me having more practice in the time I had originally written and published the stories in literary journals. Further, I had been teaching some graduate workshops up here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And I have such bright, ambitious students. Many of them are making the same errors I made when I was learning to write, which is relying too much on moment by moment narration. So in taking and looking closely at my student stories and then getting distance between the stories of Golden Heart Parade, I could be a little more critical in editing my own work. So you asked, how did working with Andrew Gifford change my understanding of the revision process? It felt so rewarding to edit the stories in the manuscript and to make such significant revisions that now I think I value the long game, as you mentioned earlier, of getting ideas down, letting them simmer a while, coming back, just never being too precious about any creative decisions I make, because they're not permanent really until they're bound in a book. Fortunately, I had time to improve as a writer and as an editor of my own work. And Andrew Gifford and the staff at Santa Fe Writers Project honored that by still giving me time and space and some creative authority in the final version of the stories. That shows not only in the words on the page, but everything from the cover art to the back cover blurb, to the headers and footers, and even the formatting silk rows between section breaks. I was allowed input in all those aspects of the publishing process, but it was never like, it was always a conversation. And Andrew would often honor my decisions, knowing that if I wasn't proud showing the cover art on social media, well, I wouldn't be proud of the book and it wouldn't be a worthwhile undertaking. I can't speak to publishing with a major publisher and what that process is like, but it felt very collaborative in working with the Indie Press Santa Fe Writers Project.
Yeah, that sounds excellent. Having a good hand in the final product, I think, right, it makes you feel better about your own work in a way that if you had less decisions, right, it might not.
And I have to say, I am good at this aspect, but I recognize I should back off in cover design stuff because I don't know much about that. So I would argue for the things I felt like I knew well, but then I would step back so that I wouldn't seem overbearing and there would be a good balance. It's kind of hard to be diplomatic, but I was able to trust other people who know more than me as well.
Speaking of things that you know well, I thought it might be nice for you to talk just briefly about your fun with songs. Specifically, right, this is called Road Songs. It has Bill Staines' lyric. And I know you have spent a lot of time DJing over the years. A lot of what you like to play, I think, is jam bands.
That's right.
How do you see like that endeavor influencing your writing in general?
I love listening to music and I have no musical talent myself, but I like curating as a radio DJ. I've been hosting a show called North Star Nugs here in Fairbanks for a few years now. It helped in terms of thinking about transitions. I've likened the process of ordering the stories of the manuscript much to when we would make a mixtape in junior high. Like, what a fun process thinking about how other people's artwork can create a sense of continuity. In the collection, on the acknowledgements page is a paragraph about some of the musical influences within the book, because a couple titles came from song titles, or there were references that felt like they should be explained or credited. For instance, like, well, the Bill Staines lyric legally must be cited on an acknowledgements page. But another title, the first story of the collection is called Worst at Night. And that title comes from the Lucero song, It Gets the Worst at Night. Sometimes just lyrics stick with me, moods stick with me, and those can be a good writing prompt.
Definitely, yeah. I think, music, since it has a rhythm and movement to it, right? Like, it is part of like the writing aspect, insofar as like any given sentence has a rhythm and movement of some sort.
Yeah, and I think you probably recognize this, especially as a poet, like the importance of diction and word placement. And I'm trying to get better as a prose writer, working toward musicality when the story merits it.
Right, definitely. Well, thanks for joining us today, Joe. And again, congratulations on Golden Heart Parade. You can get that, as we said, from Santa Fe Writers Project. It was wonderful talking with you.
Hey, Matthew, I really appreciate all your very thoughtful questions. I'm lucky to have such a smart reader. And thanks for having me on the interview series.
You bet. We'll see you next time.